Hello, Pianophiles fans, Mark Ainley here with a video presentation about Dinu Lipatti's Bartók Third Piano Concerto recording, how the recording came to be located and released, something that I was very involved with. Now, Dinu Lipatti, for those who don't know, was a legendary Romanian pianist who died at the age of 33 in 1950 of Hodgkin's disease, having recorded only about 3.5 hours worth of music for EMI's Columbia sub-label. And those recordings have been internationally acclaimed by music lovers and professional critics and professional pianists. A great many of the greatest pianists of his generation and since have considered Lipatti to be among the greatest of all pianists. Now, given that he recorded so little, of course, there's always been a lot of interest in what other recordings might be found. And over the few decades after Lipatti's death, a number of these came to be located. He only recorded 2 piano concertos, the Grieg and the Schumann, and then eventually a Mozart C major, Koelschel 467 was located, his last Lucerne Festival appearance and his last performance with an orchestra. And eventually a Chopin First Concerto was located, although for 15 years, a recording believed to be Lipatti turned up and circulated. And yet it was found out in 1981 that this was not Lipatti and an authentic one was then found. There was a Bach D minor piano concerto, Bach Busoni, in fact, quite an unconventional performance that really radically sheds a different light on Lipatti's playing. And that circulated privately before eventually being released, and I'll be tying that in because it ties in with the Bartók. And so one of the myths of Lipatti has been that he had a small repertoire because he recorded so little and because his recording producer, Walter Legge, said that he required 3 years to prepare the Tchaikovsky concerto and 4 years to prepare the Emperor concerto, which in 1991 I discovered by looking at memos that Legge himself had signed. It turns out was absolutely not true. So more on that once we get to that particular chapter. So how about this Bartók Third Piano Concerto? Now, Lipatti didn't record any works from the standard repertoire of the 20th century for piano and orchestra, although he did, it turns out, play several. Generally, it was thought that Lipatti had this small repertoire, but it turns out that he played 23 works for piano and orchestra. Now, I first found out about the Bartók when I was looking at this book in the late 1980s, this memoriam book put out by Labor et Fides. It's still available. This is not the one I was looking at. I did not steal it from the library, but I ordered my copy relatively recently, so I highly recommend this one. And Lipatti's pupil, Jacques Chapuis, commented on this, commented on the fact that he was really regretful that a number of Lipatti performances did not survive. Among them, as he says, the creation, he says in French, of the final concerto for piano and orchestra of Bartók under the prestigious baton of Ernest Ansermet, which remains vivaciously, for lack of a better term, sorry, I'm translating on the cuff, in the memory of all of those present. Turns out that Lipatti had played not the world premiere, not the European premiere, but the Swiss premiere of this Bartók Third Concerto, and that the scores had arrived on the day of the concert. And I thought, well, I mean, that must have been recorded. Surely it sounds like a historic enough occasion. And in a sense, I really couldn't understand when I first started getting into this, into investigating Lipatti recordings. Why wasn't there more? Why weren't there more live recordings when he died in 1950, when tape had widely come into use, certainly more widely, and there were live recordings of many artists going back to the 1930s and 1940s. So that really piqued my interest. Then around, it would have been 1989 at the latest, possibly 1988, but I think 89, I found out that this biography of Lipatti existed, and I ordered it from a bookshop, because that's what one did. There was no internet. And so, we didn't do direct things like that. So they ordered it, and I was told it was going to be something like $25. It ended up being 55 or something crazy for a university student back in those days. That was about 3 to 5 times the cost. Would be 3 to 5 times the cost of that now. So that would have been like paying $100 or more back then. So I was furious once it arrived, but I was quite intrigued when I flipped back. I immediately saw there was a discography at the back, flipped through, because I was really hoping to find a recording of his Waldstein. Again, another long story, which we'll get into in another presentation. But I flipped through and I saw Bartók in the discography and Piano Concerto No. 3. And it said, even gave the name of a radio station, said this recording was never issued because the conductor did not consider it satisfactory. And it states that Paul Zacher was the conductor. So I thought, okay, wait. This, I'm a little confused here, because I knew there were many bootleg labels, like the Bruno Walter Society, as they were called, that were putting out LPs of concert and broadcast recordings by many famous artists like Edwin Fischer, Walter Gieseking, Clara Haskell, playing works that they didn't record officially. So how is it that Lipatti, being as high profile as he was, that this recording actually existed and it had never come out? And in fact, at the time, I already knew Gregor Benko, who is the co-founder of the International Piano Archives, who had located all of the extant Joseph Hoffman broadcasts going back to the 1930s. He had never heard this tape. So how is it that this didn't circulate? It just absolutely stunned me. So being somebody who was, I guess I was in my late teens or 20, I was 19 or 20 at the time, and not wanting to take no for an answer or thinking that things are impossible, I went about doing my best to get my hands on this recording. So before the internet, that involved calling up the German embassy, asking for the address of the Südwestfunk. And while I was at it, I asked for some other radio stations addresses, typed out a letter saying, we've got this recording, here's the date, here's a conductor, here's a pianist, typed out the letter, printed out the letter, put it in an envelope, addressed the envelope, walked to the post office, got a stamp, mailed the letter, walked home, and waited. Now, in the age of the internet, type in a few words, click, email, and then boom, you might even get an answer within half an hour or an hour, depending on the time zone. So it was very different in the analog world. Again, something that we'll be getting to. So I hear nothing. Every day I was always excitedly looking for the mail. I had in the meantime written to some other places. Swiss Radio had a Schumann concerto from February 1950, which had already been released on Decca, not on EMI, for reasons I would later find out. There were some interviews that had not been published. So I managed to get those recordings, had to pay, I can't remember how many Swiss francs, I think 25 or 50 Swiss francs per hour for the cassette. So, but nothing from Germany. And then finally, I believe about 3 months later, I received a piece of paper with my address on it and a return address for the Südwestfunk with the name of somebody working in the Musikdisposition department. And that's it. And I flip the paper over and it looks like there's some material left over on the other side. It looks like it had been glued to an envelope and it had become detached from the envelope. So you can imagine how I felt, thinking, what is it that they sent me? I phoned the post office. There was nothing that they could do. I just wondered, maybe somebody will open the envelope and see an address in there and then send it. They put an inquiry together. But again, the analog pre-internet world, there was no tracking number on the package, no doubt. Nothing happened. So I eventually decided to call up the radio station. I think it was within a few days, once I realized the post office wouldn't be able to do anything. I had the person's name. Now, phoning up Europe was not as it would be today. It was about $1 a minute. Back in the late 1980s, it was like about $5 a minute now. So being a university student with, just part-time jobs, it was a bit of an expense. So I wanted to keep things, very efficient. I was calling Germany after all, so that would be easy. So I called, asked for the name of the person in that department, and it was connected very quickly. I have very basic German and asked if she spoke English. She said no, but she spoke French. I speak French. Great. Tell her what was going on. I just received this piece of paper. She's like, oh, that's a shame. We sent you the recording. So you can imagine how I felt. Not even charging me for it like the Swiss radio stations had done. I was, of course, delighted that they would do that, but utterly dismayed that it hadn't arrived, and couldn't really ask them to do that again, given what had just happened. So I asked what I could do, and she kind of hummed and hawed, and I said, well, I am going to be coming to Europe within a few months or within a year to do my own research. She said, you are absolutely welcome to come by and see me and get a copy. So that's what I did. In May 1990, I went to Europe, went to the UK first, went up north actually to visit Bryan Crimp, who was the founder of the APR label. He also, having worked at EMI in the 1970s, and having heard that Chopin recording that wasn't Lipatti, and actually recognized that it wasn't Lipatti, and got into a blazing argument with his producer, but that's another story. Anyway, he didn't think it was Lipatti. He knew Lipatti's playing. He could recognize it, and Bryan knew all kinds of Lipatti stuff. He had never heard of the Bartók either. So I had a visit there, and he would arrange for me on my return from the continent to go to the EMI head office. But in the meantime, I went to Paris, met Lipatti's biographer, the surviving one, Grigore Bargauanu, with whom I'm still in contact. He's just updated his biography, in fact, in French. And then on the Friday, I remember it's probably the third Friday of May, 1990, I went to Baden-Baden by train, arrived midday, walked up to the youth hostel, got on a bus to go to the radio station. And it's blazing hot, and then I start getting nervous and realizing, my gosh, it's Friday afternoon. What if I get lost? What if I don't get there in time, etc. I had called ahead to let her know that I was coming, but went around from one building to the next. Nobody knew where this woman was working. So I eventually found her when it was probably a hot, sweaty mess. And she handed me this cassette. And I asked, well, do I owe you anything? She's like, please, you came to Germany, and the other one was lost, so thank you for coming. But we put a 1 second gap in each movement, just to protect the recording, so to prevent me from pirating it. So of course I was still thrilled, and immediately when I was on the bus going back, put it into my Walkman. For those of a generation who don't know what a Walkman is, it was a portable cassette player. And I had a large one, it wasn't a Sony Walkman, because I was planning to record interviews with some people. So it was a larger one. I was meeting Hugues Cuenot, Lipatti's friend, the Swiss tenor, and was scheduled to meet Elisabeth Schwarzkopf, but in fact, she postponed, and I wouldn't meet her for another 2 years. But again, that's another long story. So I put on the performance, and I was immediately struck by two things: the good sound of the tape. I mean, it was a pretty good sounding recording, not on 78s. So it's clearly done on tape in 1948. And the speed. Lipatti was playing very slowly. He's playing so slowly that I wondered whether the tape was at the wrong speed. I didn't have perfect pitch. I would later find out, when I got a copy of Lipatti's working copy of the score, that he changed the tempo to 76 from, is it 88? It's scratched out, so I can't really read it well if it's 92 or 88. But in any case, he made that tempo change. I listened, still very calmer playing than I was expecting. And then suddenly my ears perked up because there were these electronic bleeps that just showed up. There was just this one weird bleep in the first movement. And I continued listening, and then another one and another one. So there's 4 or 5 weird electronic bleeps that were somehow on the tape. I'll just splice in a little excerpt here for you to hear. So I thought that was strange. And then there were, the 1 second pauses that they put in at different places. But, I could recognize, I didn't know the work very well. My ears certainly weren't what they are now, but I could tell it was still a very fine performance, even though Lipatti sounded like he wasn't on his top game. It turns out that he actually didn't play another concert for about a year or more after this performance. He was really quite unwell. So I still thought, well, this is Lipatti playing Bartók. I mean, this is a full concerto recording, hearing Lipatti play an entire piano concerto. This just seemed to be extraordinarily rare. So when I went back to London after touring around the continent a little bit more, I went to EMI head office thanks to an introduction by Bryan Crimp and met Charles Rodier, the most wonderful, charming, elegant gentleman, just a gentleman who welcomed me very graciously, very friendly. We discussed a couple of Lipatti things. He had a book behind him and that he went through chronologically that had something to do with contracts. He was the contract man. And he didn't show it to me and I didn't get a copy. It was a letter that Lipatti had written asking what were to happen when he died in terms of including the rights to his recordings to a successor. So the answer was that they could be passed on to his wife. So that was intriguing. And it was dated around the time of his last appearance with orchestra, that Mozart concerto in Lucerne. So that's all that I remember. But in any case, Mr. Rodier was an absolute gentleman. And after a very nice, friendly, cordial chat to this very casually dressed, teenager, essentially, in his London office, he looked like a man who was probably always wearing a shirt and tie and blazer. I was very underdressed for the occasion. He took me out of the office and introduced me to Ken Jagger, who was in charge of the historical releases. Now, I had made a second copy, done a tape-to-tape copy, and had a spare cassette there of the Bartók Third, which I gave to Mr. Jagger and said, perhaps you would consider this for release. And of course, he seemed very interested. I went back to Canada a couple of days later and heard nothing. And then the following year, I had a little bit of correspondence, and Mr. Rodier always wrote back, perhaps after a bit of a delay, I recall in some messages, but I always heard back. Bryan Crimp and I were in regular contact, and I arranged to go back the following summer. And Bryan Crimp arranged for me to go with him to the EMI archives out at Hayes. So this is where they keep the metal stampers and the pressings of all the recordings, as well as all the documentation. And I have a letter from Mr. Rodier apologizing for his delay in writing back to me, but also confirming that that he's given the authorization for Mr. Crimp to take me to the EMI archives. I believe it was Friday, the first Friday in May, 1991. So I was incredibly lucky. And, for all of the research and work that I've done, it couldn't have been done without so many people. And Bryan Crimp, I just have to, I'm eternally grateful to him and to many others, Gregor Benko and others among them, for all that they've done, because I simply couldn't have managed without them. And so I was this, he picked me up at this ridiculously early time. I had to go meet again in the days before cell phones, go to some obscure train station and wait outside on the highway in some corner. And then he picked me up and we drove there to the middle of nowhere. I was introduced to the archivist, Ruth Edge, who was a lovely lady. And she and Brian went way back. I was just given free rein. I was taken into this room, given a box with all the documents pertaining to Lipatti. And I was able to request others. So I looked up Corto and Anda and a few others while I was there. Lots of interesting documents there also. And I basically was able to copy what it is that I wanted. Now, I didn't copy every single paper there. There was a lot, and I really fished through and copied what it is that I thought was going to be the most important. But this is the documentation that relates to the Bartók Third Concerto, starting in 1963, 4th of July, where Walter Legge writes to Dr. Vader, Darth, perhaps, at somewhere is at Electrola, which is the German branch of EMI, stating that he had here the catalog number at Frankfurt Radio for a recording that was made in Baden-Baden of Lipatti playing Bartók's Third Concerto, and I shall be most grateful if you can induce them to let you make a copy tape of this recording, and if you will send it to us with a view to publishing it in disc form. I shall have no difficulty in obtaining permission from Lipatti's widow or from the conductor. Famous last words. He didn't get a reply until August 22nd. So again, this is like that analog world. It wasn't like email pacing. It took him 6 weeks, 7 weeks for the answer to be dated. So for how long for him to get a reply? Saying he needed, he needed the document, he needed the permissions. So he writes to Madeleine Lipatti on 16th of September, 1963. That was actually the anniversary of Lipatti's last recital. And he also mentions the Chopin Concerto. He's waiting to get a copy of that. I attach a form of the letter, which I suggest you and Dr. Sacher should send to me. Madeleine writes back a month later, October 17th. So you can see how this is going. Everything took forever. So it was 6 months, I believe, before they got a tape. And Walter was getting quite impatient. I'm just looking through, there's like a ton of papers over here. So December 1963, so it took a while, January 64, et cetera, et cetera. So they're talking about Gieseking tapes here as well. So in March 4th, 1964, so that's when was the first letter? July, 9 months. A classic. This is like my favorite memo of all time. Regarding Lipatti tapes. The coupling of the Bartók tape, if we can get it, would be the Chopin, if we can get it. Right? Because the Bartók Concerto is only 26 minutes. What would they put it out with? Dictated by Walter Legge, signed in his absence by his secretary. So here we go, 1964. Very mixed opinions coming. Some people saying, oh my gosh, it's a wonderful performance. Other people saying, it's kind of lackluster, orchestra and so on. And there's the note that there's something wrong with the tape. There's these electronic bleeps, and maybe it was caused by something in the mail. Now, given the fact that in 1990, 91, it was 1990, I got the tape and there were those bleeps. It was pretty clear that this is something on the master tape. So there was some concern about how they were going to be able to release the tape when there was that issue. So they're talking about that in 1964. They were still looking for the Chopin Concerto. Again, that's a whole other long, complicated story. I wrote a bit of a synopsis about it on my website. So by 1965, basically, they were discussing renaming the orchestra so that they could commercially release it, how much the orchestra would be paid, how much Boozy and Hawks for the publishing would be paid, and so on and so forth. And then it was decided Basically at the bottom of one of the memos, sorry, I flipped through and I can't find it now. It said tape considered unsatisfactory for issue in 1965. Paul Zacher was not happy with the quality of the orchestra. Quality of the orchestra / quality of his conducting. A little bit of both. It's a shame that Hans Rosbaud had not yet become the leader of that orchestra because he was a fantastic conductor, and within a couple of years they were in really fine form. So there we go. By 1965, that was axed. 1966, another tape of Lipatti playing the Chopin First Concerto came out. 1981, they discovered it wasn't Lipatti. Oops, I know the backstory to that. No conscious deception on EMI's part. Absolutely, it was not a conscious effort. Several mistakes made along the way. Some people have said that EMI stands for every mistake imaginable. The jury's out. Of course, they've done wonderful things, right? But they messed up on that one. Back in 1970 then, somebody else writes, having listened to the tape of Lipatti playing Bartók's Third Concerto, I do not think it would be in the interests of anybody to attempt to issue this recording on disc. So that was that. Now, going through Lipatti's files, I found that he was actually supposed to record the Bartók Third Concerto with Karajan in 1949. And in fact, a concert had been scheduled for December 2nd, 1949. That was 1 year to the day before he died, on December 2nd, 1950. And here's that concert program of the announcement for the whole season. And we can see over there, Bartók Concerto number 3 rather. Roussel Symphonium number 4, which by the way, is what Karajan conducted prior to him and Lipatti playing the Mozart C major concerto in Lucerne. So Lipatti didn't show up. That's another story, because of course he was very, very ill. And April 1948, 1 month before this Bartók concerto, that was the last time he made it to London. Okay, so I've got this cassette. I get back to the UK in May 1991, 1 year after, or so, 11 months after I had presented the tape to Ken Jagger, from whom I heard nothing. And actually, in fact, it was prior to going to the EMI archives, I called him up at the office and said, oh, I'm back. And what do you think of that Lipatti Bartók? Oh, could you give me a couple of days to review the matter? Translation, I forgot about it and didn't do anything, didn't listen to it. So again, what does EMI stand for? Then he got back to me in a couple of days and agreed, with the previous assessments that the tape was not worth issuing. Oh, well. So in the meantime, I went back to the continent and I met with Werner Unger, who lived near Baden-Baden in Kehl, not Kiel, Kehl, on the French, on the German side of Strasbourg. And he had a label, archiphon, and he was a wonderful collector and a very generous man. And I would then also go to Switzerland and meet Dr. Marc Gertsch, who lived in Bern. Now, he is the one who had that authentic recording of Lipatti playing the Chopin First Concerto and who gave that to EMI when it was discovered that the issued recording was not him. And that's the tape that has since been circulating with the Zurich Tonhalle Orchestra and Otto Ackermann conducting. Now, at this time, it turned out he also had acetates of Lipatti playing Liszt's First Piano Concerto. Excuse me? What's the deal with that? I went through every piece of paper in Lipatti's file at the EMI archives. There was no mention of a Liszt First Piano Concerto, but where did Dr. Gertsch get it? From Madeleine Lipatti after she died. So how is it that she had this whole Liszt Piano Concerto with Lipatti, and there wasn't a mention of it in a letter to Walter Legge anywhere in the archive? I was mystified. With All Matters Lipatti, you could say the plot thickens pretty much at any turn. I decided, being, I wasn't a business person, I wasn't an engineer, but here's Dr. Gertsch with these records and no apparatus, no transfer. He told me about this, I couldn't even listen to it. So I was like, I need to connect him and Dr. Unger, which I did. And because they were much closer in age to each other than I was to either of them, they hit it off famously. They're both very elegant, graceful, charming men, and saw eye to eye and heard ear to ear. And so a car was loaded up, driven to Dr. Unger's, and all of the material was taken there sometime in the following year or two. So somewhere in there, I heard from Charles Rodier again saying, oh, we're reconsidering the Bartók Third. I'm still trying to convince Paul Zacher, but to no avail. So we decided that with all of these recordings that Dr. Gertsch had, there were private test recordings. We found a couple of recordings of Lipatti with Antonio Ianigro, not the full amount number that we knew existed, including some Beethoven. Again, another story. But Dr. Unger managed to transfer the Liszt concerto. We had the Bartók concerto. We were trying Paul Zacher ourselves because EMI wasn't going to release it. So we asked EMI, could we release it? And yes, we could, as long as we stated that Dinu Lipatti was an EMI artist. We wanted to get Zacher's authorization, and we tried something a little bit sneaky, maybe just clever, to try to force his hand. We called German radio and asked them to broadcast the tape, because once it was public, we would be able to say, listen, somebody's going to put this out. Why don't you authorize it with us? So it was broadcast. And of course, it spread like wildfire. Gregor Benko wrote to me and said, I was just at a conference and everybody's talking about Lipatti's Bartók concerto. But he didn't agree, Zacher that is, and except he did say, well, the second movement is really lovely. That's very good. Okay, great. So we released that. So we eventually, by the time it came out, it was 1995, we put this double CD set out, which did again say Dinu Lipatti was an exclusive artist of EMI Classics, and it had the second movement of the Bartók Third, no bleeps. So that was terrific. It won a German Music Critics Award, which is great. And that was that. So no complete Bartók yet. So in 1999, spring of 1999, I'm at Narita, fast forward several years, I'm at Narita Airport and on my way to Thailand for a holiday, and I flip through Time magazine and I see that Paul Zacher has died. I thought, well, somebody's going to come out with the Bartók. And given that it was 1948, it would now be, after 50 years, free from copyright. And sure enough, didn't take long for this label to come out with the recording complete with the bleeps. No editing done whatsoever. They also ripped off our transfer of the Liszt concerto. Thank you very much. So I thought, okay, well, it would be nice for us to put out the whole thing officially, but that was there. Fast forward again. In 2000, Dr. Unger and I thought we should do a release to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Lipatti's death. So what we thought was, first what came up was the Chopin, just Lipatti in the last year of his life. We would have the Chopin concerto, since we had Gertsch's tape, and we did a fantastic remastering of it. I mean, so much better than EMI's. We had that and the encores, which actually weren't encores, they were on the program. And we had 3 interviews with Lipatti from 1950. There were the 2 which were in the Swiss archives, but then there was one he had given before the Lucerne Festival appearance, which Dr. Unger found in some private collection. I can't remember where, and neither can he. And we had that. So we thought this will be perfect. And then the Tara label just put out, again, the Bartók Third and Lipatti in 2 of those interviews. So they got the things that were in the archive. They didn't have the 3rd interview, so we couldn't justifiably put those out. So we offered our remastering of the Chopin Concerto to EMI. I mean, it was just vastly superior. And they said, no, it's okay. Ours is good enough. So we said, well, what have you got planned for the 50th anniversary of Lipatti's death? Because, you know, we'd like to release something, but we don't want to duplicate anything that's already happened. To which the answer was, oh, what do you have in mind? Or what do you suggest, rather? They actually asked us what we suggested they do for the 50th anniversary of Lipatti's death. Translation, we forgot. So again, you know, they had Bartók's Third Concerto that I had given them from 1990 to 91. Oops, forgot. And then one of their best-selling artists, 50th anniversary of their death, totally off their radar. So I said, I've got an idea. In 1991, I had suggested, based on the recordings that we'd located, a few releases. This is an actual printout from that time. And I had suggested the Bach Concerto, the Liszt Concerto, and the Bartók Concerto on a single CD. Of course, none of this went anywhere. And so I told Dr. Unger, at this point, I was not particularly enamored and was not going to write to Mr. Jagger myself. And so he did, and they said, okay, we'll pay you for the tapes, which they did. And then that would eventually come out here. I decided to Mr. Jagger to say perhaps I could write the booklet notes for this release, to which the answer was, oh, we've already assigned the notes to one of our in-house writers, but thank you for your interest in our project. That was exactly the phrase that he used, our project. So I was delighted, of course, still, that this came out. So there's an entire CD of Lipatti playing 3 concertos that were new to his official discography, in a sense, because they were released on the label for whom he officially recorded the stuff on other labels. You know, and of course, it's a real recording, but it was nice to have something. I wanted to have everything officially released, and ideally, we would have all of these other recordings released. So the reason the Bach hadn't come out, and I did find in the files in the 70s or 80s, there was discussion about this, is because it was with the Concertgebouw Orchestra and Edward von Beinum, and they were signed to another label. And this seems to have been a common theme with EMI. The reason why they decided not to release the February 1950 recording of the Schumann Concerto with Lipatti and Ansermet is because Ansermet and Suisse Romande Orchestra were under contract to Decca. And so Walter Legge was waffling about this. He said, oh, you know, well, I mean, it's kind of, you know, it's the same, we already have him playing this work. This is, you know, we'd have to pay the other orchestra and the other label and all of this, you know, when it's another contract, it's complicated. So it's not that I want Decca to release a Lipatti recording, but we won't. So that was part of the reason why some of these recordings didn't come out officially for EMI. They knew about them, but they didn't come out. So that is how this other CD of Lipatti playing works he didn't officially record, and which had circulated, some of them, actually all of them had circulated on other labels, some for 5 years, 10 years, 20, 30 years before, or 20 years, I guess, the Bach. So they had circulated for other labels, but then finally EMI came out with them because I had done this legwork, and then we had the circumstances, you know, we had the opportunity to promote that, which I was very happy to see, you know, that it's officially there. But that's how complicated it was to get this stuff out. It's not just a matter of you locate something and then poof, and then everybody in corporate decides this is a great idea. This took decades, right? So from 1963 with Walter Legge finding out about the Bartók Concerto to 2000. That's how long it took for EMI to release the Bartók Third Concerto. But there's more, because as I said, the plot always thickens. In 2015, I went back to visit Dr. Unger. And after a long absence, me not going to Europe and us not seeing each other, And by this time, Dr. Marc Gertsch had sadly died, and his son was taking care of the collection. And they looked through and they found a couple of things that they hadn't seen before. Shellac pressings on 78 and 33. It included Lipatti's Bartók Third Piano Concerto. And these came from Madeleine Lipatti's collection. Additionally, a recording that we had released on here, which we didn't have the details, it's like circa 1948, of Lipatti playing his own concertino, which it turns out was played at the same concert as the Bartók Third with Paul Zacher. And we know this because the details were on these new 78s and LP pressings that we found, which were signed and dated by Madeleine Lipatti in 1954. Okay, so once again, Walter Legge found out about this Bartók Third Concerto in 1963. Madeleine Lipatti had a copy in 1954. She also had a copy of the Liszt First Concerto, presumably by that time, and there's not a mention of it in the EMI archives. No idea how that recording came to be made. The plot continually thickens. We still have no idea. We still have not found any letters. There is a letter, I believe from 1973, in which she mentions the Liszt Concerto and wanting to get it transferred, as well as the Bartók Concerto, but that is it. But nothing anywhere in EMI's official archive talking about the existence of these recordings. So what else she had is a mystery, because, buckle your seatbelt, folks, when she died, she had become quite friendly. She became quite reclusive, but she had become quite friendly with Dr. Gertsch and trusted him. And when she died in 1981, 82 or 83, sorry, I forget the date now, it was after the Chopin Concerto incident in 1981. I believe it was 82 or 83. Dr. Gertsch was allowed to go into her home and take what he wanted. I guess some friends were allowed. He said there were some large boxes of records there. He took 2 of them, which was not all of them. He didn't want to appear too greedy all at once. So he took these 2 boxes, and when he went back another day, the others were gone. So who knows what else is out there. Now, eventually some private recordings ended up in Brooklyn, which are now released on Marston. That was another long, very complicated story, and those did come from Geneva. They had Lipatti's autograph on them. They absolutely are authentic. And again, there's not a written letter anywhere that talks about how or when these recordings were made. We estimate 1945 because of a few reasons, given what was found in there and what Lipatti was playing at concert at the time. But there's always a mystery with Lipatti. Nothing is straightforward. And you would think, given how many Edwin Fischer and Gieseking and all of these other artists, how many recordings exist, that there would be more of Lipatti. But like those records that ended up in Brooklyn, it seems that collectors who have Lipatti recordings can be really quite possessive of them. And it took several years for us to get our hands on those records, and it was only when the collector died and a mutual connection alerted us to that fact, and we managed to get them. That's again another story that I talk about. That's in a podcast with Jed Distler. I talk about that whole story. But that's the deal with Lipatti's Bartók Third Concerto entering his official discography. Something I was really delighted to be able to help with. And there we go. So here is hoping, of course, that many more Lipatti recordings will be found, but that's the backstory to this one. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation and the sharing. I just think it's easier to do this kind of thing and be able to show things and talk directly to a camera, although sometimes it's hard to keep my eyes on the little green light. So I hope you've enjoyed the presentation. Leave a comment below and stay tuned. I'm sure I will be making a few more similar videos in the near future. Take care and happy listening.